Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the General Eclectic Podcast with Rod Dreher. I'm your host, Kale Zeldin, and we are returning for episode number 47. We are, Rod, coming up to our 1-year anniversary. But as always, there's plenty for us to dive into. In fact, we're in the immediate aftermath of the much ballyhooed anniversary of the January 6th affair. Look, you posted on this, and so it's not necessarily something new, but I thought it would be worth chewing on a little bit because I for one was kind of dreading it. To be blunt with you, I just I sort of knew what everybody was going to say, and they did not disappoint. Although I have to say, Rod, the levels of sanctimony were really quite something to behold. I don't know what you made of it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to be clear for our listeners, I think what happened on January 6th was an atrocity. It was horrible. Boo Donald Trump, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to defend that or downplay it at all. On the other hand, it's so clear that the Democrats and the liberal media have taken that horrible event and have blown it up into being something much worse than it actually was, as bad as it really was. They made it something much worse, and they surrounded it with this pageantry of this mawkish patriotism. They went and stood out at night on the Capitol and sang "God Bless America." I mean, I'm glad. I don't want to criticize Democrats for singing "God Bless America," but come on, this
one suspects. Yeah. Just maybe that there might be a level, a layer, a sense of cynicism with that. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, to me, watching the media, listening to the radio, reading the papers about it, they made this out to be such a huge deal. And again, don't get me wrong, it was a big deal. It was an appalling thing that happened, but they were claiming that our democracy stood in the balance, that these idiots, these MAGA idiots, actually stood a chance of overturning the government, which is not true at all.
It's risible. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. And fine, we can do all the sort of the throat clearing about, we condemn this, that, and the other. I'm going to skip that because that just kind of annoys me at this point. But what really strikes me is to suggest that this sort of collection of sort of redneck LARPers is actually threatened the Constitution of the United States is just silly. And so in all that throat clearing stuff you said, I completely agree with, that they were stoked and they were led on and it shouldn't have even gotten to that point. Fine. No arguments from me. But to watch the sanctimony again, it was just this. I think you called it a pageant of victimhood with a candlelight service. And then did you see the Lin-Manuel Miranda performance?
No, I'm afraid I didn't.
Well, Nancy Pelosi sort of gets on some sort of weird Zoom call, and the cast of they sing a song from Hamilton, and I'm just. It's just embarrassing, Rod. It's pathetic. But to be serious about it, there seems to be, and of course, all of the national, outlets, television and news outlets had all of their stuff prepped and ready to go. There are a load of, anniversary pieces and what it was like to live there and what it was like to go through it and all of that. I mean, and it was utterly predictable. But my question to you as a longtime observer of sort of the cultural scene, beyond the merely politics of legislation, et cetera, I mean, what do you see as the point of all this? What is happening here?
It's to create a narrative. It's to own the narrative. It's to own history, define what happened on that date in a particular way. And whoever gets to define history is able to control the future. You control the remembrance of what happened. And I think this, by the way, is why you have some on the Republican side who are being, equally cynical and denying that there was anything that went on untoward. But the Republicans don't run the national media. And
No, no,
you know,
of course not.
I read something the other day online where a writer in Ireland, Dublin, was talking about how he spent like a week or 10 days only watching mainstream media, the sort of stuff his mom and dad watch because they're
So this is
older.
just like an experiment. He was sort of running this as
I
or he
think so.
just
Yeah, he
happened
was
to.
staying with his mom
Got
and
it.
dad or something.
Got
But he
it.
just said,
Yeah.
what would happen? Because he gets his media like many of us do
Yeah.
from online, a lot of
Yeah.
different sources. Well, he only went to the national broadcasters. This is in Ireland, and he said it's a really different picture of the world. It's a much
Yeah.
more simplistic picture of the world,
Yeah.
and if that's the only place you get your narrative about what happened in the world, then you are going to see the world in a very different place. I think this is the danger about the way the mainstream media handled 1/6. You know, they are setting up a narrative that becomes the standard emotional reference point for people as to what happened on that day. And I mean, it's a difficult thing, Kale, because I mean, you and I both agree that it was horrible, and I do not want to be on the side of those who say nothing happened or it was all a
Yeah.
government setup. And I believe that the last year has vindicated my belief on that day that this was going to be used by the left as a Reichstag fire, as an event or a pseudo event
Mhm.
that was going to they were going to use to justify cracking down on conservatives. We've seen this especially in the U.S. military since then. But I think that when you have this pageant going on national TV, on the radio, and the newspapers, and you get this aggrieved sense of national occasion right up there with 9/11.
Well, and Pearl Harbor as well. I mean, our
Right.
vice president, explicitly invoked Pearl Harbor, explicitly invoked 9/11, and saying that these are sort of kind of matching dates. And I had to do a double take on that, Rod. I was like,
Yeah.
wait, what? And oh, geez, just
Yeah.
really pathetic. But so I wanted to jump in here. As chance would have it, I am pulling together my notes for a lecture that I deliver after my students read Macbeth with me, and it's on the Gunpowder Plot. Because I do a little bit of sort of historical stuff, and I like to do that sort of historical positioning after we read the play, just to sort of give them a kind of a more pure experience of the play, and then we start doing a little bit of the history.
So what's the Gunpowder Plot?
So, well, it really struck me. The Gunpowder Plot is the sort of the famous, if for our British audience, our UK audience, it's remember the 5th of November, and this is when a group of Catholic recusants planned and almost pulled off really quite a spectacular terrorist attack on King James and all of Parliament. They had found a way to sort of rent the basement, basically, of Parliament, and they had stuffed it with loads and loads of gunpowder and metal and all kinds of things, and they were going to literally blow up Parliament when James was going to address Parliament on unification. And fortunately for the Crown and for Parliament, one of the conspirators, as the conspiracy, as the job itself became more difficult to pull off, they had to kind of expand the inner circle. They had a kind of original core of 5 or 6 guys, and it expanded out to 12 to 15 guys, and then one more time to bring in some capital. I think, as my reading suggests, there was one of those sort of third wave guys that said, you know what, this doesn't sound too good, and kind of tipped off Salisbury, and so at any rate, they are sniffed out before they're able to pull it off. And there's a sort of a relatively pathetic dash for it, and then they get rounded up. And this, of course, is the where we get Guy Fawkes Day from, right? And the reason why I'm bringing all this up, and sorry, audience, if I'm boring you with some seemingly obscure history, but I like to look at patterns and things. And I have thought for a while that we are living in a kind of weird sort of landscape that reminds me of the English Reformation, and the kind of backs and forths between, the Protestants will come in and kind of take over, and then the Catholics kind of reinstate things, and then the Protestants take over again, and then there's questions of secession. And so I do think that there's a kind of rough pattern here between competing narratives of what is true. Okay, competing narratives. And I do think that politics and religion are deeply intertwined. Contra to some of my sort of capital L liberal friends, I do think that these are similar mental receptors, right? I think it operates in that same zone. And this is why the rise of the nuns has actually amplified our religion. I think you could argue, actually, historically in this country, that our religious diversity and pluralism has kind of kept things basically peaceable, especially amongst largely Christian nation.
Well, when you say nuns, you mean N-O-N-E-S.
I do mean
not Catholic sisters.
Right. I meant the N-O-N-E-S. I think that political tempers are flaring. The temperature has risen substantially. It's because we don't have those typical ways that mitigate the passions, and so politics really does become the sum total of a kind of religious impulse. And I think this is also why politics seems to be a little bit more passionately upheld by those on our political left, is because most of the people on our political right have tended to be more explicitly religious. And so there's always a kind of divided energy there, right? But I do think that that's waning. Right.
Oh yeah. It's I remember back in 2010 when the Harvard political scientists Robert Putnam and David Campbell from Notre Dame came out with their book American Grace, sort of a snapshot of American religious life. They found that all Americans, whether you're on the left or the right, pick their churches based on the church's politics rather than pick their politics on what the church teaches. So, if you're Catholic, and if you're Catholic, that meant you would tend to go to a parish that was more conservative. Even if politics proper never get mentioned from the pulpit, you know who your tribe is.
Yeah.
And so it suggests that politics is the ultimate, for most Americans, whether they realize it or not, politics tells us more about ultimate realities than religious faith.
Right. And so what I've found interesting, especially in the last, 2 years now that we've been in this COVID era, is that our physical liturgies have waned by virtue of being locked down and locked out of our gathering spaces. And as we have retreated to these sort of social media liturgies, the scrolling of your Twitter feed or your Facebook, thread arguing and Instagramming and all of that, especially amongst the older folks, I do think that these temperatures have flared dramatically. Anyway, I'm bringing all of this up because the Gunpowder Plot, what was so interesting to me as a sort of an amateur historian, is that the state was very canny to use it to great effect, right? That in that kind of classic way that you don't let any good crisis go to waste. James and his handlers, especially Salisbury, use it as a way of sort of forwarding the agenda of the regime. And the trick, though, is that the Gunpowder Plot didn't happen, right? So they had to craft this kind of...
You say didn't happen, meaning that it was not executed.
Exactly, right.
They foiled it.
Before they were able to light the fuse to literally blow up Parliament, it was stymied. And so they're in this sort of weird situation where something bad was really going to happen, like no doubt. It was all there, but that they were able to craft a narrative of this sort of by engaging the social medias of the day. Through sermons at St. Paul's Cathedral, pronouncements at Parliament, and it was really a kind of dramatic sort of public event. And of course, this is before social media and even really newspapers as such. And so but it didn't happen, right? And so, but it is fascinating to me as I'm making this sort of rough comparison, is that, something happened, as we could all see. Our televisions lit up and our smartphones lit up. In fact, I even remember I said, Rod, turn on your TV. You got to see what's going on. And you're like, wait, what? And we sort of watched it, at the same time as these idiots were LARPing their way, with the QAnon shaman and all of that garbage. It was quite something to behold. But what really was it? And you can see all these arguments about: is it an insurrection? Is it a war? Is it a riot? Is it a protest? I mean, all of these things have a kind of an emotional and truth value to them, don't they?
Well, yeah, it's like the principle in quantum physics that, that it requires an observer, that things are indeterminate until an observer sees them. Think about the way the George Floyd riots were packaged and were folded into a myth by our media. They weren't riots; they were rebellions. And we were told. There's a famous meme of a CNN reporter standing in front of a burning building in Kenosha or somewhere and saying, "Oh no, things are mostly peaceful here." I mean, but this is the same exact thing. They are trying to frame information that is being presented to people. They're trying to tell people what they're looking at, and this is something that we all do. It is a way to control what people think. It's a way of manufacturing consent to whatever the government or those in power want to see happen.
Well, that's a loaded phrase, the manufacturing.
Well, it's a Noam Chomsky phrase.
Break it up, but I think it's appropriate right now.
No, they are. I mean, think about what the media, the liberal media, and the Democrats want us to think and to do by construing the events of January 6th in the way that they are. If they want us to, rebuke Donald Trump for what he did in that role on that day, and these QAnon shaman types, I'm all for that. I'm with you. That's why I supported the second impeachment of Trump, because of his actions on that day. But they're going way, way, way beyond that. We've been talking about this, I think, from time to time on this podcast, but I've been hearing for months now from active duty service members in the military or recently retired ones talking about how woke things have gotten, and how after January 6th, and we know this isn't just hearsay, the administration and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin went on a witch hunt to root out any so-called right-wing extremist within the ranks. Well, look, if there are neo-Nazis or people in the ranks that want to overturn the Constitution, by all means, find them and throw them out. But that's not really what's happening. What's happening, according to the people I'm talking to, is that anybody who has anything to do with conservatism in any way is now terrified that they are going to fall afoul of the commissars.
Right, exactly. And this is where I think my example, I think, can even get us further illumination, that there's a fear of a loss, right? There's a fear of a loss. And you and I have commented on several occasions that those on the left seem to be really kind of tone deaf about this spirit that they're invoking in racial identity politics. That on the one hand, you can speak freely about race identity as a net good and a bounty and an important component of one's identity, unless you're a different color. And if you're a different color, then all of that's bad, and you can't talk about questions of replacement and all this sort of thing. And so it's playing on those kind of fears. So now think about the Gunpowder Plot situation, because in the Gunpowder Plot situation, you have a Catholic recusancy class, which was largely wealthy.
Well, what is recusancy class for those who don't know the history of that era?
Sorry. So good. Thank you. So the recusants were those that recused themselves from mandatory church attendance in the Anglican state church, in the English state church, right? That they were Roman Catholics. They remained Roman Catholics despite Henry VIII's initial initiation of the Reformation. They stayed loyal to the ancient faith of England. And they lived, and then I'm skipping over. So Henry does all of this, starts the English church, and then his daughter Mary comes in and kind of resets it back. She's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and so she reestablishes Catholicism, and she's in I think for not even a decade, maybe like 6 or 7 years. Somebody will fact check me in the comments.
Well, the point was simply that the Catholic recusants are those who stayed Catholic, and they were therefore considered, they were suspected by the state.
But the timeline is important. So for 47 years, these recusant families maintained the faith and did not participate in the state church throughout Elizabeth's reign. James comes in, and he's an interesting figure because his wife is Catholic. So there's great hope on the part of the recusants that they're going to at least receive a little bit of religious tolerance, that they'll be able to participate in sort of to go along, to get along. It'd be some sort of détente. Well, he does not go there. He says no. So this is what kind of instigates. So the Catholics who have been holding on for almost 50 years were like, well, screw this. We're going to blow the whole damn thing up, right? So this is that kind of idea. But you have embedded in this is the threat of loss of some kind of original story of the self, the story that these families were telling themselves about themselves, where that they were the sort of the Catholic remnant that were holding out, and James just kind of shat all over that, right? And so that's why I'm bringing it back to this. So what are these people frustrated about? Our media has shown themselves completely unable, except for maybe 2 days after Trump's ridiculous victory in 2015, right? For about 2 days, they were like, well, maybe we missed something. And then they dashed all that. And they have shown themselves completely incapable of understanding why a Donald Trump won the presidency in the first place. I think, and so as foolhardy as the actions of this mob were, as foolhardy and egregious as the actions of Trump in stoking this mob were, okay, what we still do not want to reckon with is why these people were so upset. Like there's still a level. Again, I'm not condoning any of the activities and all of that LARPing on Capitol Hill. It's not my gig. It's not my game. But still, why are they so worried? What's going on? And it's not just like stupid, white Christian nationalism or whatever. I don't buy that either. I do think that there's a fear of a loss of something essential about what they feel it means to be human and what they feel it means to be an American.
Yeah, it's a sense of dispossession, and these people, a lot of them are not articulate. Mm-hmm. They don't have. They wouldn't be able to be hired by NPR, for example. But
for many reasons.
Well, but the fact that they are inarticulate and often drive me nuts. You might remember the long thing I wrote about the Jericho March in Washington. Nevertheless, I mean, we are constantly being asked, after the George Floyd riots, we were asked to consider the pain of African Americans that would lead them to riot like that. Well, that I get defensive about that, whether it's on the left or the right, because I mean, law and order is so important, but it's actually true that we need to try to put ourselves in the minds of people who behave in massively antisocial and destructive ways. It's not to excuse it, but to try to empathize and to try to understand what makes them do that. And I think that for the mainstream media in this country, certainly the Democrats, they saw January 6th as the natural culmination of Trumpism.
That's correct. I do think they think that.
Yeah, and whereas a lot of conservatives think that the George Floyd riots were the natural culmination of progressivism, of woke progressivism. To step back from both narratives, though, one is reminded, as one so often is these days, about Alistair McIntyre's point that the reason we can't ever solve any of these pressing issues is because we have such vastly different myths that we live by, which is to say myth in the sociological sense, a story that tells us who we are and what is right and wrong.
Who we are, what is right and wrong, and what we're supposed to do and be in this world, right? Absolutely.
And so I last week heard, it was either last week or this week, I was in the car, NPR was on talking about the 1/6 atrocity, and they had they had the host of whatever call-in show it was, whatever talk show it was, said, we're about to bring on a Republican member of Congress who disputes all this. Now, we at NPR, she said, we really hesitate to put people on who say lies, but we feel that we need to let people know what Republicans are saying. I laughed out loud. I'm like, wait a minute. You at NPR don't like to put on people who mention lies. What was all this reporting and puffing of the 1619 Project, which is demonstrably false?
Right.
They don't care though, because that's part of their myth.
Right. And it's so difficult. Like, it's hard, to know when you've been captured, right? Like that by your own myth. And I think that one of the things that I try to do all the time is to ask myself the question, am I missing something? What are my priors blinding me to? What are my priors opening me up to? And that can be good and that can be bad, but you have to have that kind of examination of conscience, examination of perspective, self-examination. And I just don't see much of that, Rod.
No. And again, on both sides.
I know,
because I a lot of people on our side, on the conservative side, trying to minimize what happened on 1/6. And I say to them, listen, if that had been a black mob, a Black Lives Matter mob that broke in and did that, would you really have to stop and think about whether or not this was as bad as all that, Mr. White Conservative? No, you wouldn't. If instead of Ashley Babbitt barreling through that door, if it had been, a black woman, and what would you think about it? I don't have to really wonder what white conservatives would think about it, because I know.
Right.
Yet flip the script and suddenly we find all these rationalizations, exactly as the left does when their favored actors behave badly.
Right. And I think that this is the power of a frame. The power of a frame, if you look at January 6th and as a sort of this standalone event, and you might have a sort of an anchor out to the original election of Trump in the first place. But if that's sort of the way that you frame this thing, it's awful, it's terrible. But then, what we're trying to do is sort of, if you expand that frame out a little bit, all the way back to the summer of 2020, just a couple of months removed, and you see these protests that turned into riots pretty much every night for this span of time, all of a sudden, we are left to see well, wait, why does this thing over here merit, a liturgy, a public governmental liturgy of Kamala Harris comparing this to Pearl Harbor, and on the other hand, that's just that's the voice of that's that's truth, telling truth to power, right? That's
speaking
that's
prophetically from the streets, a prophetic voice of the streets.
Prophetic. That's it. Well, and it's like, how do you square that? It's like you're not being an honest broker. I don't think.
Well, here's something that you ask about the frameworks that we impose on things. Here's something that I've been thinking about recently. We seem to be marching up to some kind of conflict with Russia over Ukraine. I don't think that we're going to get into a shooting war with them, but I remember 20 years ago when the government framed the whole 9/11 in a certain way to manufacture the American people's consent to war on Iraq. Right. And the American foreign policy establishment was for this war and all that. We had to do this. We had to fight them over there so we don't fight them here. We had to spread democracy, blah, blah, blah. Well, we see where that got us. And I was a dupe and went along with this and gave them my consent too. Well, now we're hearing some of the same people, in fact, saying, well, it's time to stand up for democracy in Ukraine and all that. I'm like, whoa. I'm not saying that Putin is a good guy, a bad guy, or whatever. I'm saying that we don't have any business there. Why? Let's not rush into war. But it's astonishing to me how I'm hearing now coming from liberals who read my blog saying, well, what, you're not willing to stand up? It's just like Hitler. It's just like Munich. You're advocating Munich. And I'm like, don't you see what you're doing, you idiot? Have we not learned?
So you just said, don't you see what you're doing? And what I've been thinking about is the power of these scripts, right? I mean, you and I, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago now, when I remember us talking about when Trump came out and basically just trashed the foreign policy elite on one of the debate stages and said that Iraq was a debacle. And you and
January
I,
2016, the day Scalia died. I remember.
okay, all right. So and you and I were, I remember you and your blog, and we were talking later on. It's like, I can't believe that a Republican got up, a person, vying for the Republican nomination just said the thing.
Yeah.
Like it was a
and he got booed. It was in South Carolina. He got booed for it.
But he did it anyway, and he stuck to his guns, which was just shocking and kind of impressive now that I think about it again.
Yep.
But that script is such a deeply embedded one, so much so that you can find yourself behaving and thinking and talking in ways that, if you can kind of snap yourself out of it for a second, you're like, wait, do I really think that? Why am I saying these things? And so your question about the establishment, sort of gearing up to rah an intervention with Russia in Ukraine, it's like, man, wait a second. What spirit are you acting out right now?
Yeah. I mean, it's breathtaking, But we become prisoners of our own narratives. I remember back in 2002 when I was at National Review and just starting to write about the abuse scandal in the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
One of my best friends was a Catholic priest. He put me in touch with a seminarian down in Texas. My priest friend had helped this seminarian get out of a really bad seminary and into a solid one. And I ended up talking to this guy down in Texas, a seminarian. He said that when he went into the seminary, it was for an order seminary. He said that this was what he's smiling about.
I fear that I know what you're going to say, but go ahead.
Well, anyway, at this seminary, it was all run by the Lavender Mafia. There was lots of open homosexuality. He came home for one of the breaks and told his parents, he said, look, we had a Halloween party this year at the seminary. The rector put a sign up saying no drag this year. So everybody came dressed in BDSM, bondage, domination, sadomasochist gear. And he told me, the man said, my parents wouldn't believe me. My parents called me a liar, their only son, a liar, because they could not conceive that this institution, the Catholic Church that they were devoted to, and all the myths that go around with that, it couldn't be true what he was saying. And so he couldn't depend on his parents to help him out. He found this good priest. And anyway, this is just one example. We've seen it countless times in any number of situations.
Well, it's fascinating to me that the narrative, these prior scripts that we have, these initial scripts, I'm just going to keep using that word. It's a kind of an algorithm, I suppose, they run the risk of becoming so pure that not only do they disentangle themselves from reality, but they're also hyper fragile. Yeah. And it's interesting to me to hear you say that here is their flesh and blood, the son that they love, and they are proud to send him to become a priest of the beloved Catholic Church, and he's coming back to them firsthand account saying this stuff, and they can't square that circle. And that says more about themselves and their script, their sort of take than the actual truth that their son was giving witness to. And so I think a lot about that, like these scripts, these powerful scripts. And I think a lot about it. I think a lot about this in terms of where we are in the church. Not just in the Roman Catholic Church, but just in the church in general. And it strikes me, here we are, Rod. We're still in the sort of the aftermath of you having published "Live Not by Lies." And one of the things that I know you share with me from time to time, especially when you start talking in front of groups of people, is that there still seems to be some sort of resistance amongst faithful church-going folks. Even at the professional level, that it can't be as bad, Rod, as what you're saying. That this is you are the one living by lies, right?
Yeah, or that politics can't help us. That's the latest thing that Dreer's just giving up, and look,
Right.
I've always said, and I say again, we need to try to stay involved in politics to protect ourselves as long as we can, but we're not going to vote our way out of this.
Mhm.
Because the problem is not ultimately political. The problem is religious and cultural. We have so many problems on this front. But just this morning, I was talking to some folks at a seminary in an advanced class at an evangelical seminary, and we were talking about this very thing, that people in the pews, so many of them cling so with white knuckles to the narrative, because they can look around them and see the world falling apart, and yet they don't want to believe it, because if the testimony of their eyes is to be believed, then things are not what they ought to be. Hannah Arendt said that one of the things that's a mark of a pre-totalitarian society is when people stop being interested in the truth and information about the world as it really is, and instead prefer only information that validates the story they already hold. She says they won't even, when it gets to such a point, they will no longer believe the testimony of their own eyes and their own ears, but rather they will believe information that coheres with the story they hold internally, and that makes sense according to the myth. And of course, you can do that for a while if you control the myth-making machinery, but ultimately reality is going to reassert itself very painfully.
Okay, so I'm going to sort of change the topic, but in order to try to get at what you're saying here. So we know right now in the United States of America that we lack the sort of cohesiveness to sort of forge a kind of a singular narrative. But we do have examples of countries who are all too willing to crack the necessary eggs to make the necessary omelet of unified narrative in a place like, communist China. Communist China is very dedicated to not losing the narrative. They are not dumb. You and I certainly have our more than quibbles with the way that they go about and do their business. But these people, especially the party, have studied for years on why the Soviet Union fell, and they seem to be very invested in creating that one unified narrative. Now, do you think that that's something that can sustain itself?
I don't know. I think what China is doing is something that we've never seen before. It is a totalitarianism that is taking place within a highly technological society, one that whose means of communication, the internet and so forth, is easier to control than we would have thought. I mean, a lot of people think that your information wants to be free and you can get it on the internet one way or the other. In China, they've shown that if they're willing to completely ignore basic classical liberal principles of free speech and all that, that they can shut off parts of the internet, and they can punish people. They can make them afraid to seek out information elsewhere by punishing them with the social credit system. In Live Not by Lies, I quoted from a book by a German correspondent named Kai Strittmatter, I think his name is. He was a German journalist living in Beijing for a while, and he writes about what the techno-totalitarian state is doing to the Chinese people. He quotes a teacher, a high school teacher in China, saying that the man is really worried about his students. He said they don't know anything about what happened at Tiananmen Square. That has been scrubbed from the official histories. More to the point, he says, they don't want to know. They're happy to be coddled and to believe in the order that is presented to them, and have no idea that they are being played. And the thing, as I recall, the thing that frightened this teacher more than anything else was not that so much that the state was controlling this, but that the state didn't have to work as hard as it thought it did, because people just didn't care.
It seems to me, as I think about this, that's a stunning insight. If it comes to pass, if that's true, and I have no reason to think it's not true. It seems to me that they have figured out incentive structures in a way that the totalitarianisms of the mid-century early and mid-century, were not able to figure out. The Soviet Union was clearly not able to figure out incentives. So therefore, the people did, in fact, long for the freedoms that they saw as emanating from the West. And you and I have read some amazing accounts of a Soviet era professor coming to the United States of America on some sort of an exchange and walking into a grocery store for the first time and just being blown away by the abundance of it all, and therefore they could make a very quick kind of mental calculus. United States capitalism, full grocery store, good, right? So there was it was obvious that this was a good that they were being kept from. Whereas in the communist Chinese system, they figured out that necessary component. They've cut that off, right?
Right, because it's not freedom that the people really wanted; it's material abundance and comfort.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And the Chinese have figured out that they can have material abundance and give it to their people without giving them freedom. I well remember back in when I was getting out of college, and Deng Xiaoping was opening up China, making it capitalist.
Mm-hmm.
All the talking heads on the left and the right said, well, it's now just a matter of time before China democratizes, because their theories told them that with economic prosperity, liberal democracy must follow. Well, China has defied that completely.
Yeah.
And I think when you consider how incredibly poor China was before Deng opened it up, that would the Chinese want to go back to that kind of poverty in exchange for civil liberties? Probably not. But I think that in our country, we are going to be faced with this, Kale. This is the whole one of the
What do you mean?
basis.
What do you mean?
This is one of the bases of the soft totalitarian argument that I make in Live Not by Lies, that the totalitarianism that is coming towards us is not going to require gulags. It's not going to require secret police and things like that. It's not going to have bread lines. Rather, the people who run our society, and I'm not just talking about government, I'm talking about big business, institutions, and so forth.
Facebook, Instagram, Twitter.
They will make it where if you want to participate in and get a job in society that is going to give you a really good income and raise your status, you are going to have to participate or avoid certain things, certain organizations, certain people, and so forth. And people will police themselves because they don't want to be left out. They don't want to be poor.
Okay. They don't want to be poor or weird, right? And that's something you and I have talked a lot about that, especially early on in our first year. We talked a lot about Christians. So I do want to bring this back to the church, because that's ultimately where you and I believe this is all has to play out. Do we American Christians have the stomach that it's going to take to be weird and different and odd and not part of the table, so to speak, to be shut out from, the room where it all happens,
right.
Sort of thing. And I don't know. I mean, look, you've been, interestingly to me, I hope I'm not putting you in an uncomfortable space here, but you've been very loath to comment on vaccine passports and all those sorts of things. And I wonder if you see that as a kind of a backdoor way in which this soft totalitarianism ratchets itself up.
Oh, I absolutely do. I mean, and look, caveats, I'm vaccinated. I think most people should be vaccinated, but I also strongly believe in religious freedom in people's freedom not to be vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And I think that this whole vaccine scheme that's going, for lack of a better word, that's happening in Western Europe and here in the US is going to be a precursor to a social credit system, whether they intend for it to be or not. I think we will look for it. Go ahead.
Well, I guess my frustrations here is that I appreciate your caveats aside, and we certainly don't want to do anything that would imperil lives. But as I see it, and who am I? I'm just some random teacher in Rhode Island. But they don't work. The vaccines right now do not work for the Omicron variant. The percentages of people who have it, they're all vaccinated. I live in the most heavily vaccinated areas of the country, and everybody's getting it. And
me too. I found out just this afternoon my priest has it, and he's been vaccinated.
Right. And so here we have all these people who were the good people, right? They did what they were told to do. They got the 2 shots. They did the whole thing. They've worn the mask when they were asked to wear the mask, and all this sort of stuff. And none of it's working, right? And yet, still, 3 days ago, President Biden gets on the TV and tells me that this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Like, it's not true.
Oh, it's not true.
Stop it.
No.
And it's like you're lying to me, and you're trying to get. And then, of course, I'm sitting there, I think, and again, as an innocent bystander, I'm just observing the scene. What's the incentive? So they're all telling, go get boosted, get the 2, go get boosted. Like, why? It literally doesn't work. Why are you insisting on this course of action? Like, I don't understand it, Rod.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I do know that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, said last week that the unvaccinated should be treated as, quote, non-citizens. He's saying they are outsiders. Wow. They are outside the republic. He's scapegoating these people. And that is, if you might not think this is a big deal with the unvaccinated, but what happens when it's your turn? It's your tribe's turn to be made pariahs of. Right. And that's where I think that this is getting people accustomed to fearing others and loathing others and fearing contamination. We're talking about very, very primal human emotions here.
Powerful and primal. I mean, that is, no joke. And, I know that everybody hates when you bring out like sort of the arguments about Nazis and whatnot, but, this is very much the way in which totalitarian regimes have separated, out groups and created in groups and created that kind of fracture that allows for the kind of control. And I'm pretty concerned about it, to be blunt. I don't know where this is all going, and I don't know like where to go. Like, is there any respite from it? Is there any like home base from which to go?
That's the thing. Well, let me back up a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago, I think it was last year, she had it declared that racism is a public health emergency. That sort of thing has happened elsewhere. Okay, so you've had a country that's been frog marched through this whole radical scheme to deal with this virus, and I believe the virus is real.
Well, obviously it's real.
Blah,
yeah,
blah, blah.
Obviously, yeah.
Okay, but we give up civil liberties to protect ourselves from this public health threat. Okay, so what happens now? Let's say we defeat this, and we're told that racism is a public health threat. So if you hold views that the powers that be believe are racist, you are threatening the health of the people in your city. What has to be done to you? What can't you participate in for the sake of maintaining the health? We talked about this before on this podcast, Kale. Remember me talking about how back in the year 2000, thereabouts, the GLSE and the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, they figured out a way to get schools to accept their LGBT propaganda. They said that, hey, it's just about safety. We're trying to fight bullying. That's all we're doing. Nobody can possibly be in favor of bullying. But what they did was they made this highly contentious and debatable political claims about sexuality. They made it into a matter of safety. If you didn't accept this, then you didn't want us to have a healthy, safe school.
Right,
Genius. Right. That same principle is now being played out in other areas, I think, on the broader society.
Yeah, and there's these weird sort of clamping downs on information. We as a free society should welcome access to information and counter narratives, and let's hear what people have to say. Yet that's clearly not the case. Clearly that is being sacrificed. And so when I look, to go back to the top of the show where we were talking about, the events of January 6th. it's like we're being ramrodded into sort of a one narrative to rule them all for reasons that I am deeply suspicious of.
Okay. I can see that we're running out of time here, and I wanted to bring in, piggybacking on that, the Netflix movie Don't Look Up. You haven't seen that, have you?
I have not. No, sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. It's not a great movie, but I'm glad I watched it. It's a comedy. Leonardo DiCaprio playing a scientist who discovers, an astronomer who discovers a comet headed straight for Earth, and there's no way to defeat this thing, or there might be a way, but he goes and tries to get people awakened to it, concerned about it. What he finds is that nobody wants to hear it. And it turns out that the whole thing was conceived by Adam McKay, the director, to be about climate change. But you can see that, and you can see its biases, because the problem in the movie is this right-wing president played by Meryl Streep doesn't want to take a political risk to fight this. Okay, we see their agenda. But where I think the movie succeeds is in the way it shows how we in America, especially in our media, have ways of deflecting bad news. Like he goes on to the DiCaprio, and I forget the name of the actress who's his research assistant. They go on
Jennifer Lawrence. Is that Jennifer Lawrence's character?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I don't know what the young people are all watching these days.
The kids these days, the kids.
But they go on a show that's kind of like Morning Joe with Joe Scarborough, Mika Brzezinski, and they're saying, we're all going to die. This thing is coming straight for us. But the hosts, they just can't deal with it. They sort of deflect it and to make it into a comedy thing. The message here is that we in American society can't stand bad news. So we're going to find some way to deflect it, whether it's through politics or through, framing it in a certain way. And you ought to watch the movie, Kale, just so you can test out your framing theory, because that's what's happening here.
Yeah. And again, I haven't seen it, audience. But just based upon what you're saying, Rod, I mean, this sounds like an image for your entire career. Like I mean it. I mean, like, you kind of like, guys, this is bad. Like, no, like I'm not joking. Like, this is pretty bad. God, no, really, I'm not joking. Like, this is going to get pretty bad. Like, oh, Rod, please, it can't happen here. You don't understand. Blah blah blah. This guy, and so but I think that you were talking about your earlier conversation with seminarians and all these groups, and it's like they don't want to hear the actual bad thing. You can't be so wedded to your fragile narrative that it can't sustain the addition of some data that might alter the picture.
Yeah. Well, I was talking today before you and I came on with a journalist in Poland at a Polish newspaper, and we did a Zoom call for something he's writing, and he doesn't accept my live not by lies Benedict option idea. And he's like, well, why should people take their kids out of public schools and put them in religious schools? Don't these kids have, shouldn't they be there to be a witness to
the salt and light argument? Yes, I'm very familiar with the salt and light argument.
Yeah, and I told him, I said, look, I can't speak to what the situation is in Poland, but in our country, and of course I told him about how hostile the public schools are to Christian values, and how about the whole social contagion with transgenderism and all that. And the guy just couldn't understand what I was saying. And I think we agreed to disagree that this could be a difference in cultures, and it legitimately might be that. Poland is much more monocultural than the US is, but
there's a little bit of a subtraction theory going on with Poland, isn't there?
What do you mean subtraction theory?
Well, the secularization thesis. They're going through their own process of secularization. It's later than most other places, but it's happening, right? And this is something you've been mentioning, yeah. And well, he brought up the journalist at the beginning of the conversation. He brought up a story he had done about Quebec and how quickly Quebec secularized. And I said, yes, and Ireland too. And I said, I was told in Poland that Poland is heading the same path. And he agreed with me. Yeah. But he seemed to think that this was a good thing. And he was strongly opposed to the idea that the state taking the side of the church in these matters helps the church. He thinks it actually accelerates the secularization. See, I'm surprised that you don't agree with that.
Well, no, I'm not saying I don't agree
Oh,
with
okay.
it. I think it probably is true, and this is where I've run into. I think that the whole integralist project is just ridiculous because, I mean, look at Ireland, look at Quebec, look at what's happening in Poland now, and look at Spain after Franco died. I think he has a point, but I think that it's a complex point because I don't think that the Christians should stop trying to advocate for the church to protect our institutions and our rights. But what this does, though, and this does, it's a less subtle point than it might sound. It does say that we Christians are fools to expect the state, the power of the state, to hold back the effects of culture forever.
Mm-hmm. Right, because ultimately a culture has to be compelling or not.
Yep.
If the culture ain't compelling, then no amount of state power is going to save it from being a farce. And I mean, I think that's what I struggle with is that, look, I teach kids, I work with kids all the time, and I'm always thinking about like, well, what is it exactly that is uncompelling about the gospel? Right. And as a Christian, I don't necessarily believe that it's the gospel's fault. I do think the gospel is profoundly compelling. But why is it that the cultural forces in place render it dumb, render it stupid, render it unsexy, render it uncool, and address that? Like, make it look I've been in places where, church attendance is mandatory and it's like, be careful with that because it's more likely going to create again, I'm not talking about within family structures, I'm talking about in social structures. It's more than likely going to create resentment and anger.
And you have to ask yourself, if what we believe is true and good and beautiful, then why would we have to force people to accept it, or to use the power of the state to order people to accept it? And it's such a complex thing. I was just talking to I put a post up on my blog about a conversation I had last week with a Protestant man who contacted me saying that he and his family are done with Protestantism. They're considering Catholicism or Orthodoxy. What do I think? And of course, I tried to be as honest with him as I could. As you know, I'm not a triumphalist about this. And I told him, don't think that you're going to be able to escape modernity in either church. Right. But, I told him that one of the things that I had to learn the hard way was that this is not the question of which church to settle in is not a matter of sitting down with all the arguments and figuring them out. Has a lot more to do with practice. And
it's religio. It's a binding practice. It's not. Amen.
Because I told the story about how back when I was working at the Templeton Foundation in Philadelphia 10 years ago, I was in the break room heating up my lunch, and it was just a bowl of cabbage soup or something crappy. And one of my colleagues there, who was a Greek Orthodox, raised Greek Orthodox, but had become an evangelical in adulthood, he said, why are you eating that? I said, well, it's a fast day for the Orthodox. He said, fasting? I'm like, yeah. And he just shook his head and laughed. He said, I grew up Greek Orthodox in Manhattan. I spent all my school years in the cathedral school. Wow. Never once did anybody talk to me about fasting. So I say that as a cautionary tale to, like, if you think that you're going to escape all this stuff by moving in under the canopy of a very rationalistic religion that says all the right things, you're fooling yourself. You've got better find a community of practice.
Yeah. And I think it's important for our audience to understand where, you and I come from. You and I are like heavily intellectually oriented guys. Mm-hmm. Like, I write and think and chew on and read all day long about these kinds of matters. But I sort of follow, I don't know, maybe this is apocryphal or I'm slightly have the story slightly wrong, but I've always taken seriously the story of Thomas Aquinas in his final days, where he has this vision, and Thomas Aquinas is arguably, the finest Christian philosopher of all time. perhaps Augustine could make an argument, but nonetheless, a hugely influential and important guy. And so when
James Martin is there too, let's not forget him.
Well, yeah, and James Martin. No, but that at the end of his life, after writing the Summa and all of that, this massive testament, right? He has this vision in which he emerges from the vision and says, all of it's straw.
And he never wrote another thing.
Never wrote another thing. And to me, the cautionary tale for me is not don't think, don't write, don't read, but rather understand what those things are ultimately meant to serve. Those things are ultimately meant to serve my kind of being okay and at peace with proper worship.
Yeah,
what does the Lord want me to
serve?
do? Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think we really flip that. Especially, well, we all do. We want to instrumentalize these things and make them, make the cart the horse instead of the horse the cart, or something.
We want to
like
make order out of chaos. That's what human beings do. But we happen to be in a time of great disorder now, where all the institutions and the practices that allowed our ancestors to make order out of chaos have failed, and we're trying to figure our way through this. Indeed. I see now, Kale, that it's our hour is up.
It is. It's been a good hour. It's been good to get back into the saddle here post Christmas and all of that. Just before we leave, have you you mentioned that you saw, you were watching your movie there. Over the break, I watched Stranger Things with my kids, and I'm kind of obsessed with it, and I'm kind of working on some thoughts and ideas. So maybe next time we get together, I'll have a pitch to make to you about why Stranger Things is worth your time. So
great.
We'll see.
All right. Don't get nothing on you.
All right. Take care.